and especially the director of the library, Joe Lucia. We are especially glad that you've chosen to come to this talk, which is a part of our Scholarship at Villanova series sponsored by Falvey Memorial Library. But we would also like to invite you to return to the variety of other events we have here in the library. And I especially want to promote next week on Tuesday we'll be having our Black History Month event that we're co-sponsoring with Africana Studies. Darlene Clark-Hine will be coming to speak. So please check out our list of upcoming events in the library online. Now let me introduce our speaker. Paul Steggy graduated magna cum laude from Princeton University with his A.B. in German and Politics. He went on to earn his A.M. and his Ph.D. in Modern European History from the University of Chicago. An assistant professor in the Department of History, Dr. Steggy, for the past 7 years, has been the director of the Department of History Lecture Series. It is also worth noting a few of Professor Steggy's collaborative projects. He is the co-organizer of the Modern Germany Workshop in Philadelphia. He has contributed to an essay on the nature of Alltagsgeschichte and has co-edited the H-German online discussion group since 2002. Fluent in Russian as well as German, his concentration in teaching has been in post-1945 Europe. His courses include Hitler and Nazi Germany, the history of everyday life, the experience of violence in 20th century Europe, and the Cold War. Author of several articles and invited conferences presentations, his book Black Market Cold War, Everyday Life in Berlin, 1946 to 1949, is our focus today, and I would like to mention that they are available for sale at the back of the room. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Steggy.
And thank you, and thank you to Falvey Library and Joe Lucia for inviting me. It's a really great opportunity to be able to talk about work that winds up being produced in isolation for so long. And in that spirit also I'd like to say a word of thanks to the History Department, because as much as this is a book that has my name on the cover, the way in which it evolved depends upon lots of conversations in hallways and over lunch and debates and discussions. And history really is a collaborative undertaking, and trying to figure out what it is I was actually thinking was greatly facilitated by my colleagues, and I am very grateful for that. What I want to do today is to try to talk a little bit about the ways in which this book is embedded in a series of stories both that involve me as a historian looking back at this time at the middle of the 20th century, but also as a way of thinking about stories as a different way of embedding a series of events, big events, small events, and trying to tie them together in different ways. Last week, Roger Cohen wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in which he talked about how high school students in Berlin knew almost nothing about the Cold War, that it was as relevant to them as the Holy Roman Empire, he suggested. And he was a little bit shocked about this in Berlin, of all places, that somehow the Cold War no longer had any relevance or any resonance. What I've discovered, and what my book tries to explore, is the ways in which, even at the time, people didn't have a very good understanding of what the Cold War was, or how the Cold War actually worked. To some extent, this is a question about how we remember and how we look at things. But I want to suggest that part of the problem is our failure to think about the everyday life side of the story, and to think about the ways in which the Cold War is not something just imposed from the top down, but is something that's produced on the ground in places like Berlin. And this everyday life approach to history is certainly the way in which I've approached the field, but I want to try to sketch that out for you a little bit, so to think about the ways in which we collectively can try to imagine these kinds of stories, and to think about the ways in which they might bring the past, bring this particular set of issues, bring Berlin a little bit closer to us. In general, we think about things, events, processes like the Cold War. We think about it in terms of definitive moments that somehow can be captured, celebrated, demarcated. And 2008 is a good opportunity to do that, because there are lots of nice Cold War anniversaries that are coming up, especially if you're talking about Berlin. After all, 1948 is the point at which we see the beginning of the Berlin Blockade, which is in some ways the event that is at the center of my book, or at least obliquely at the center of it, because I'm trying to undermine the power of that event and the power of these kinds of anniversaries as absolute, an absolute explanation about what was going on. And just give you a sense about how I came to that approach. I was at an anniversary event 10 years ago, so on the 50th anniversary of the Berlin Blockade at Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. And there was a big crowd there. Bill Clinton was speaking, President of the United States. Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, was there. And they're gathering together to celebrate this moment of German-American friendship, German-American cooperation, and to look back at this humanitarian gesture in which American planes and British planes flew supplies into the city of West Berlin. And they had an old vintage C-47 there on the runway, and next to that they had this brand new, being dubbed on that day, the Spirit of Berlin. And everybody joined together in celebrating this great event of 1948, 1949. There was one Berliner there, one stand-in for the population of Berlin. This woman who, as a girl, had lived in Berlin during the time of the blockade, and she talked about standing at the edge of the runway, edge of Tempelhof Airfield, and watching for the planes that would fly in. And there were some planes in particular that would start to drop chocolates by little handkerchiefs, little parachutes that would fall down to the children on the ground. And this, as it was, as is the image of Berliners during the blockade, of passively waiting at the end of the runway for the supplies, the candy, the goodies to drop from the air. And that this was the only way in which they survived this time period. I want to try to look at these Berliners and to talk about them not just as passive objects of great power politics, but to think about the ways in which they were really important to trying to tell this story, and to think about the ways in which they made the events in Berlin, and in a way also helped to make the Cold War. So, just to try to think about this event that now I'm going to try to work around, as it were. The standard narrative of the Berlin Blockade goes something like this. After the Second World War, Germany was split between four occupying powers: the Soviets, the Americans, the British, and the French. And they each had their respective occupation zones. And Berlin, the former German capital, was likewise divided into four occupation sectors, one for each of the powers. Now, Berlin itself was located 100 miles, or a little bit more than 100 miles, within the Soviet zone of Germany. And fairly quickly after the war ended, the grand hopes for cooperation and collaboration between the occupiers began to break down, especially about how to organize the political system, about how to organize the economic system of Germany, and these hopes for cooperation were quickly eroding. At the same time, there was this ongoing crisis of daily life in which people were hungry, that there wasn't enough food, and the economic system was in tatters, and they were trying to figure out how to manage that. And part of this was tied up with the fact that there wasn't really a functioning currency, and so they're trying to implement a currency reform, and this is a big moment in which there's no cooperation on either side. And so by June of 1948, the Western powers finally decide enough is enough. They declare a Western mark, a new currency, and they're going to put it into place in their zones. The Soviets see this as the first step to creating a separate West Germany, and they counteract with their own currency in the Eastern Zone. And this conflict, this crisis over the creation of separate German states, then becomes the moment that ushers in this first great battle of the Cold War, the Berlin Blockade, in which the Soviets seal off West Berlin, prevent food from getting in, and essentially try to starve the Western allies out of the city. Recognizing this, the American officials under the military governor Lucius Clay respond by organizing an airlift in which planes fly almost non-stop from the western zones, bringing in flour and coal and dried potatoes and all sorts of goods of that nature to keep West Berlin alive. And the remarkable success of this airlift then becomes the way in which Berliners are able to hold out, to resist Soviet efforts to dominate the city, and eventually the Soviets are forced to back down almost a year later. There's only one problem with this heroic account, which was so transformative in the relationship between Germans and Americans in particular, is that it's wrong. The blockade around Berlin was never absolute, and in fact the Soviets never intended to try to starve West Berlin into submission. And what we have as we explore this period over the summer of 1948 and the fall and even into the early part of 1949 is not so much an absolute seal as a blockade with lots of holes, some intentionally created by the Soviets and some organized by Berliners. So if this narrative of absolute blockade countered by a heroic airlift is undermined by these stories on the ground, well, what does that say about the ways in which this iconic event mattered for the Cold War? And these are the stories I want to try to tell for you a little bit today. And I want to talk a little bit about the chronology that goes before this big event and also comes after it. And to think about the ways in which these stories on the ground become pivotal towards unpacking the ways in which the blockade and airlift assume this iconic status in the Cold War, and how the Cold War is also going to be depending upon the assertions of this kind of iconic meaning and not paying attention to what was going on and what actual ordinary people were doing. So let me talk a little bit about where we're starting. My book looks at a period from 1946 to 1949. And when I was first talking about it to people, one of the first questions I was getting was, well, why start in 1946? Why not 1945? And I assure you it wasn't just out of some sort of contrariness, some desire to be different, but to think about the ways in which there was a post-war set of practices that by 1946 had begun to be normal. And we need to think about this particular place, not in the abstract, but as this real city, a city of a very large scale, probably 4 times in terms of the size, the geography of Paris, spread out over this huge area, with a population of this time of about 3 million people. But it's a city that's also in ruins, following hundreds of bombing raids, following a brutal battle for the city in which the Soviet armies advanced in April and May of 1945. And so we have to imagine how people are surviving in the midst of these ruins. I started in 1946 because by 1946 people have begun to figure out how this post-war environment works. They've begun to develop strategies to survive in the midst of this. How to cope with the scarcity, how to cope with the fact that their apartments don't have glass in the windows, how to cope with the fact that they very often don't have running water or flushable toilets, and that these kinds of small, mundane practices are precisely what are going to dominate their lives. Now, if we think about Berlin and we think about this post-war, we will perhaps acknowledge that well, of course, there were shortages, there were limits, and so the way in which that was coped with was that the occupation officials stepped in. They rationed things. There was a system of rationing, and that these scarce goods were allocated on some sort of rational basis by authorities. Okay, sure, there was a system of rationing. So how did rationing work? Well, there were a number of ration categories in a city like Berlin. They were split up by, depending on one's profession, depending upon one's political past. So if you had been a Nazi, for example, then that had a detrimental impact on your ration category. And you're given a ration ticket that had lots of little coupons on it. And every time you would buy something, you'd go down to the grocery or go to the butcher or go to the bakery. You would detach one of your little tickets, and the shopkeeper would take it and paste it into their little book. And you were given so many grams of bread or so many grams of meat or so many grams of vegetables. And this was allocated according to some sort of desire, well, that heavy workers needed to have more caloric intake, and that somehow this was the necessary preconditions for rebuilding society. And on some level, it seems like that was the case, right? We calculate that how many calories were being allocated, but even these guarantees of having a ration card didn't necessarily translate into actually getting those goods. So for example, if you had a ration card that allocated so many grams of sausage to you, well, it may be that there wasn't any sausage. So even though you had the ration ticket, you would go to the store and there wasn't any sausage available. It may have been that even though your sausage coupon entitled you to so many calories of nourishment from sausage, that the sausage you actually got was full of a lot of water and fat, and that maybe there wasn't very much nourishment in there. So that already in the exercise of this rationing system, we see the ways in which it is being undermined. And it was, even when successful, not really fulfilling people's nutritional needs. Just to give you a sense about how that worked, there was a great cartoon in this weekly newspaper in January of 1947. This was a weekly newspaper targeted especially for women. And there's a cartoon, and it had a boy sitting at a table, and his mother was serving him something, and you could see in the background kind of an improvised stove that had a pipe that was just kind of going out the window. And the boy asked, "Mother, do we always have to eat calories? Couldn't we occasionally have a piece of cake?" And I think this is what we need to think about, that as we imagine how people survived in the midst of this post-war environment, it wasn't just about translating calories on paper into nutrition that was then translated into work and so on, but that there were these actual negotiations that were constantly at work in terms of how can people put together a meal. Right? And so maybe you would go to the store and there wasn't any oil, and so they say, well, we're going to give you an equivalent caloric value in sugar. You say, all right, well, I have 100 calories of sugar instead of 100 calories of oil, and you may say, well, that's equivalent, but if I'm trying to cook potatoes, sugar is not going to be nearly as effective for me as oil. So how do you deal with this breakdown and this assertion of rational organization of post-war survival strategies? People developed strategies from the very beginning. And in fact, these are strategies that they had been utilizing already in the 1920s, during the economic crisis of the late 1920s and the 1930s, during the war itself, that they depended upon an economy of connections. They would negotiate with people they knew. Maybe they had a garden plot on the outskirts of the city. Maybe they had relatives or friends who lived on a farm on the outside of Berlin. Well, you would negotiate. You would make deals. One way of describing this was that the most important vitamin of the time was vitamin B. So in German, the word for connections is Beziehungen, starting with B. So that what you really needed was not mere calories or vitamins, but with these connections. This is what you depended upon. Where did you find those? Well, you found them especially in the black market. And I want to talk about what that is. And we have this sense of the black market dangerous. And I think we also need to think about it as much more ubiquitous. It was something that everybody knew where it was. Everybody knew how to get there. And as some graffiti outside of a Berlin cemetery in December of 1946 put it, so imagine this right around the Christmas holiday, anyone who is not lying here by New Year is a black marketeer. So what was the black market, and how can talking about the black market tell us anything about this big event, this big process, the Cold War? The black market was something that was essentially hidden in plain sight. And this is this irony. On the one hand, it's something that's technically illegal, and yet you find it everywhere, in the main squares, around railroad stations. These details, these deal makings that will take place on a very transitional basis. So you'll be walking down a street and people will gather together and they'll come together and there'll be a kind of a whir of conversation in the background and a deal will be made, or maybe it will shift into somebody's apartment in the back room and another deal will be exchanged, and that it was about finding what one needed to survive. Now, the regulations that talked about black marketing differentiated between all kinds of different ways of participating and whether you tried to get rich or whether you were just trying to get by. And there was a certain moral evaluation that went along with this that was also very fluid. So if you rode the train out into the countryside and dealt with a farmer, well, maybe that was acceptable. If you stole from the farmer's field, well, maybe you weren't so certain that was such an acceptable or a good idea. If you only got enough for your family, well, maybe that was something that you could evaluate acceptably. But if you were trying to make a profit, if you're trying to get rich, well, that became a little bit more dubious. Now, the lines here of demarcation are not simply legal. It's not just a question of there being a legal structure that condemned black marketeering. This became something that was institutionalized in a way, and on which everybody depended, whether you were official organization, whether you were an occupation force, that there were these multiple layers of participating in these different acts of survival. American soldiers would bring in a case of cigarettes that they could pick up at the at the PX, and they could rapidly transfer to a fairly sizable return. The cigarettes would then make their way up. The black market became a modicum of exchange, especially when they were dealing with farmers in the outskirts of the city, and that there was this multiple layers of involvement that people found reasonable and acceptable, and that were simply necessary for surviving in the midst of this environment. Now, we have this tension here, because on the one hand, there's this constant assertion of how bad the black market was, and how dangerous it was, and how it undermined the normal functioning of an economy. After all, when we have currency reform in 1948, one of the big goals is to eliminate the black market as somehow something that normal economy inhibits the redevelopment of Germany after the Second World War. At the same time, there's a kind of celebration of the black market retrospectively. You know, the black market was where West Germans learned to be good capitalists, and that somehow this then translated into a successful post-war West German democracy. So how do we evaluate this? Part of the dilemma here is to think about the meanings that get tied to and get connected to this black market, and how they also are continuing to shift. So if we think about this place, the black market, that depended upon people's initiative, that was operating in these squares and these spaces and these railroad stations that everybody knew about, and the police knew about too, right? And they knew where they were. So how did people respond and evaluate them? Well, we begin to see the ways in which this also gets tied up into the high politics of the battles for Berlin as well. In terms of the ways in which different politicians and different parties are asserting their ability to control the black market, to counteract the black market, to stabilize the economic situation, and none of them are able to deliver. Right? The communists guarantee their ability to solve the material crisis. The Social Democrats guarantee their ability to address the material crisis. The Americans and the Soviets guarantee their ability to deal with this material crisis, and none of them are able to deliver in this period that I'm looking at. But their inability to deliver is going to have different implications for the ways in which what they're doing is perceived and is understood. And what is going to be quite interesting is that the willingness of Berliners to cast their lot with the Social Democrats in particular, with the Americans in particular, is going to alter with the ways in which their different involvement with these material crises get invested with certain meanings by Berliners. That the West and its rhetoric of freedom is going to resonate with Berliners in spite of the fact that the West is never able to deliver on the material guarantees that they offer up. Let me talk a little bit about how that works in just two specific examples of the ways in which the occupying powers tried to intervene. Care packages and payok. So payok is the Russian word for ration, and these are packages that were given to Berliners by the Soviets, and they're given especially to Communist Party members and intellectuals. And the care packages were these collections of chocolate and flour and coffee and other in many ways, luxury items that were granted by Americans and given to their supporters and given to other people who would perhaps win them in contests or have these special access to these privileges. And the different interpretations of these two material grants, I think, is very telling in terms of thinking about the ways in which Berliners understood what was going on in their city. A care package was much more than just a collection of material stuff. There was a way in which it helped to elaborate the luxuriousness of the West, the incredible wealth of the West, and there was also a way in which it helped to elaborate the intense desirability of the West. The payok was also deeply desirable, although it tended to be, in some ways, less exotic, containing more things like lard and flour than Hershey bars and coffee. And the tension here became, for Berliners, played out especially in the ways in which these different gifts of the occupying powers were perceived and understood. For the Soviets and the recipients of Soviet packages, there was a sense that these were tied to a commitment to the Soviet system, to the Soviet occupiers, and that there was a sense of a quid pro quo in which you took the Soviet goods and then you allied themselves with the Soviet occupier. And this was the real condemnation of the Communist Party in Germany at this time, was that they were simply the German arm of the Soviet occupiers. Well, why was this such a big problem? Well, it had especially to do with the legacy of the immediate post-war period, in which Berliners' first experiences with Soviets had been in the ways in which the Soviet soldiers had essentially lived out all of the threats of Nazi propaganda, of mass rape, of violence, of pillage. And so that even into 1948 and 1949, there was a way in which the direct linkage between a political association with the Soviets was tied to a physical experience of violence at the hands of the Soviets. So even though there was a broad acceptance of the desirability of a kind of socialist solution to the political problems in post-war Berlin, the sense that casting one's lot with the Soviets tied one to this legacy of violence always cast a pall on the material benefits that you got from the Soviets. And so you can see this in kind of the reports on the popular mood, in which people are denounced for receiving Soviet goodies. Essentially said, you don't care about anything German, essentially. You'd rather crawl up the backside of the Soviets as long as you got your extra ration, is kind of the ways in which people thought. On the other hand, the incredible wealth of the Americans was operating in a very different way. And it was, in some ways, one that fit more effectively into narratives of possibility in which there was room for maneuver for Berliners, that there was a way in which there was an open-endedness in this material relationship that on the one hand asserted that the Americans were giving gifts and providing goods and providing benefits, but didn't necessitate the direct political, social obligation that people interpreted in this exchange with the Soviets. That is, that there seemed to be more room for maneuver in this relationship with the West, and that as much as there was a lot of criticism for the Americans and the British, and especially the French occupiers' failure to deliver material benefits to Berliners, there was also a sense that there were benefits and possibilities in this relationship, and that it was desirable, and that they at least asserted the possibility of freedom, and that the rhetoric of freedom and this image and the symbolism of freedom is something that was going to be particularly appealing to Berliners, precisely because they saw in that the opportunity for them to make their own deals. Let me just give you one particular example. in the spring of 1947, and you notice all these examples I've been giving so far are before the blockade. I'm not even talking about the big event that supposedly is at the heart of this project. In the spring of 1947, a woman wrote to the Berlin government and complained about the black market, and complained that she didn't have any opportunity to get things on the black market, and that her son was going hungry, and that she, like many other mothers in Berlin, wished they'd just been hit by a bomb during the war. That would have been better than having to endure this horrible suffering that they faced right now. And that the only people who were benefiting were all the politicians and the black marketeers. Yet, at the same time that she was asserting this, she was describing, well, of course, from time to time, the only way you can survive is by turning to the black market. She's undermining her own denunciation of the politicians in claiming the necessity of this room for maneuver. And it's precisely that this way in which a room for maneuver, this recognition of the ways in which people needed to depend upon themselves, upon their own connections, I think that becomes an important way in which people began to see the value of the possibilities of a rhetoric and of a practice of by the Western-leaning parties in Berlin. Now, so we have, on the one hand, this assertion, this liberty, this rhetoric of freedom. We have this ongoing struggle to survive that is being managed most particularly by individuals on the ground. What I want to try to do in just a few minutes left is to talk about the ways in which this comes together in this Cold War event, the blockade, the airlift, and how they tie together. We think about the blockade as this absolute set of controls. I mean, this is the rhetoric that continues to operate, even today. But the restrictions that were being imposed that the blockade were not something that came out of nowhere, and in fact have much more continuity with the structures that were going on before. So police raids on black market sites, police raids on trains coming into the city. There was a system of checkpoints called the Ring Around Berlin that was set up already before the blockade, in which people were designated in which there were checkpoints that were asked to stop vehicles, to stop pedestrians, to stop bicycles, and seize goods from them that they were illicitly transporting from the surrounding Soviet zone into Berlin. But this was never working very well in practice, not least because these checkpoints weren't very well supplied, and the ability of a checkpoint to carry out effective controls of coal trucks, for example, was hampered by their need to bargain with those same coal trucks to get supplies of coal to heat their little huts. And that, in fact, there was a broad willingness of all of these controllers to participate in these same relationships and these negotiations of survival, that they were not excluded from these same arenas. And that their sense of the need to intervene was, in many cases, quite half-hearted. And that whether it was the population or whether it was the police or whether it was politicians, there was a sense that those who were really committed to eradicating the black market were somehow dangerous to the people's ability to survive. And so in this sense, the controls that became part of the blockade of controlling access to Berlin were building on or part of these same structures of controls that are already existing for a number of years before. And the ways in which Berliners responded to this were precisely the same ways that they dealt with police controls and seizures in 1946 and 1947. They looked for ways around it. So what would they do? They'd be riding on a train, they'd pull the emergency brake, they'd throw their stuff out, they'd get out and they'd walk across. Remember, Berlin is a city full of ruins, and so you don't have to just walk on the streets. There are lots of holes in houses that you can walk between and around and through. In a lot of checkpoints, they wouldn't bother to control bicyclists or pedestrians, and so you wouldn't drive in a car and you would walk across. Or maybe you would send packages, you would mail things to post offices in surrounding areas. These are the practices that people were developing in the intervening years that they continued even during this period of absolute blockade. And just A great example that comes out to me, this is in January of 1949, so it's at the high point of the winter of the blockade, and the Soviet sector police is absolutely frantic because of the ways in which things continue to make its way into Berlin, and they say, you know, there are all of these people riding the subways and the streetcars, and the police try to stop them, and young people will get together with these gangs of these rowdies, and they'll hold the doors shut on the subway so the police can't take people out. And so they're trying to get trade unionists and Communist Party members to go and ride every day back and forth on the subway to help the police to make sure that rowdy youths don't keep the doors closed and spit in the face of the police and things like that to undermine these absolute controls that are starving Berlin into submission. So what we have in the midst of this is these same practices of survival that people have been developing before this big event, the blockade, are continuing all during the midst of this blockade. December of 1948, American Secretary of State George Marshall gets a memo that asks, basically, is Berlin blockaded? And the answer is essentially no. Now, his response to this memo is one of a certain amount of panic, because he suggests, well, what happens if the Soviets really do decide to blockade Berlin? How are we going to respond? What are we going to do? How are we going to deal with that? Well, maybe we should cancel elections that are scheduled because we don't want to be too confrontational. We don't want to destabilize the things. You know, it could get really dangerous. And this was opposed, especially by American forces within the occupation government in Berlin and in Germany more generally. Not least because of the ways in which they felt now that they had obligations to Berliners and Berlin politicians that had been continually reasserted in the midst of this escalating conflict. So part of what we see here is the ways in which American, British, French obligations to Berlin become something that are not just constructed by the West, by these great powers, that Berlin is important for this global struggle of Cold War, but the ways in which they get tied to a place like Berlin is going to be driven by these personal obligations that they develop to Berliners and to Berlin politicians. So all of a sudden we start to think about the ways in which Berlin, as this iconic battleground in the Cold War, is being constructed not by high politics formulated in Moscow or in Washington, but is being driven by relationships, by connections that are being cultivated on the ground in Berlin. Yet in the midst of all this, we have this assertion of the blockade as absolute, as total. The airlift as the sole means of Berliner survival. I talked to this veteran of the airlift, and he went back to a reunion in Berlin and other parts of Germany, and he was wearing some sort of airlift commemorative Air Force jacket, and somebody came up to him in the street with tears in his eyes and said, you know, I was a child in Berlin during the blockade and you saved my life, and thank you, you're the first airlift veteran I've ever met. This is a really powerful example. And it tells a lot about what the airlift came to mean if it doesn't tell you anything about the ways in which the airlift worked. And this construction of an iconic blockade airlift duality is a really interesting phenomenon. In the 1950s, there would be blockade survivors who would come into Berlin classrooms to talk about the ways in which they survived the blockade on kind of Spam and dried potatoes that were flown in by the airlift. And this isn't just my experience, that Berliners are hesitant to acknowledge their own role in overcoming the blockade. A whole host of interviewers, of historians who have looked at this find, say, well, of course we never bought anything on the black market. No, we never went off into the surrounding Soviet zone. No, of course we survived only by things came in by the airlift. And then gradually you would ask questions. Well, did you have any relatives in East Berlin? Well, yes. Well, and did they ever visit you? Well, yes. Did they ever bring anything? Well, yeah. Whenever they came over, they would bring some coal in their pocket or so. And so that that people had to be pushed to gradually unveil and unpack their own participation in their survival. And this becomes really significant because of the ways in which this great iconic symbol of the Cold War and the ways in which a noble American participation in the Cold War was enabled and enacted, the airlift, depended upon the participation of Berliners. That is, the airlift facilitated a Western victory in this battle. But in spite of itself, in spite of the fact that it never was doing what it claimed to be doing, that is supplying the material needs of West Berlin. And so when we start to think about the Cold War and how this account of survival in the midst of Berlin in the late 1940s, how that then translates into some larger implications for the Cold War, I think that it becomes quite telling because it suggests, on the one hand, that the Cold War is never just imposed from the top down. It's not just that Berlin was this empty space in which the two superpowers happened to encounter each other. But the way in which Berlin came to function in the Cold War depended upon the ways in which Berliners also interacted with each other and with these occupying powers. When the blockade is resolved, I mean, there's these diplomatic negotiations to end the blockade, what becomes quite interesting is how it also coincides with a railroad workers' strike in the western half of the city. And that this, in effect, reimposes the blockade in indirect level because train travel is not being allowed and all of the rail traffic within West Berlin is being shut down. And ultimately, the strike by Western railroad workers against the Soviet-controlled rail authority is broken by the Americans and the British. So at the very moment in which they're asserting the freedom and independence of West Berlin and the need to defend it against the Soviets, they're breaking a strike against the Soviet authority. To me, this is really interesting because essentially it becomes a small case of the ways in which the Cold War operates in practice, that it depends on a kind of unintentional collusion between East and West. It's not to say that there's some sort of grand conspiracy between the Soviets and the Americans to divvy up the world, but rather the ways in which their practice of Cold War was not just about imposing tension and deposing their conflicts upon others around the world, but also about trying to manage the conflicts that they were drawn into and managing situations that, for all of their rhetoric, they never were able to control. And this is really what the Cold War is about, this tension between assertions of absolute control and the danger that these situations are never completely in control. Just to wrap up here, if we think about the Cold War as this big conflict that has this global reach over the second half of the 20th century, and try to imagine when it ends, a lot of time, or at least another iconic moment is November of 1989 when the Berlin Wall comes down. And this becomes part of a series of events in the fall of 1989, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the elections that take place that summer in Poland, kind of driven by solidarity protests, and the people taking to the streets all across Eastern Europe and bringing to an end Soviet communist domination of Eastern Europe. To me, it becomes really quite interesting that we're willing to acknowledge a popular role in the end of the Cold War. That is, we're willing to give the people a place in ending the Cold War, but we're not generally willing to give the people a place in constructing the Cold War. The construction of the Cold War is something that is limited to states and statesmen. I want to challenge that, and I think that what we can think about is the ways in which the Cold War is dependent upon the ways in which Berliners and many others around the world try to make their own worlds, and that the story of the blockade is not just about communism versus democracy or the Soviet Union versus the United States, but it's also about trying to figure out how to find enough to eat, how to find enough coal, and that these are practices and strategies that transcend the high political events. The conclusion of my book begins with an event that has another anniversary in 1948. This is, excuse me, in 2008, and that is the 45th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's speech in Berlin in June 1963, in which he famously declares, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and no, that didn't really mean I am a jelly donut. Some of you may have heard that account. But what becomes so important about this moment in 1963 is that Kennedy says to the world, come to Berlin. Come look at the wall. Come to Berlin and look at the ways in which this is where you'll really understand what the Cold War is about. You'll understand this battle between communism and democracy, between the free world and the Soviet Empire. But what his speech does, for all of its power, is to reduce Berlin to a merely iconic location. If Berlin is just an icon in the Cold War, then what about the people who really live there? If everybody can say, as long as they're battling for the free world, ich bin ein Berliner, that I am a Berliner, what about the people who are really Berliners and their battles to survive in the midst of this complicated, messy, convoluted situation after the Second World War? Kennedy's ability to make these kinds of iconic and symbolic gestures depend upon the practices that take place in the period that I look at, 1946, 1949, in which the Cold War is formulated not just by policies from above, but by practices of survival neither side, the Soviets or the Americans, are ever really able to control. And to me, this is a story that offers us both a cautionary and an optimistic vision, because it suggests, on the one hand, our role as human beings and our complicity in the worlds we make, and in the worlds in which we find ourselves, but also the power to transform them. And to me, that, I think, is a very powerful assertion of how everyday life and ordinary people can matter greatly. Thank you very much. So I guess now this is the point where we enter into questions and answers and all the things that I didn't talk about that you wish I talked about. So, yes?
What do you think stopped the Russians from shooting down the C-47, starting a shooting war?
Well, I would say that suggests that the goal of the Soviet control measures was directed primarily against the Western powers, and I don't think that was the case. When I look at the documents in East German archives, and this is one of the benefits of doing research in a time period after a state collapses, that all of a sudden everything is available, what you discover is that what they're really concerned about is their ongoing inability to control things even in their zone of occupation in which they supposedly have total control. And in that instance, Berlin is dangerous not just because it somehow is this iconic place for the West, but it also is dangerous because of the ways in which it exerts influence over an area that they are increasingly finding difficult to hold on to. And so is Stalin interested in perhaps leveraging their position and perhaps getting some sort of benefits in terms of thinking about forcing the West out or something like that? Indirectly, but I think the point is that rather than seeing Berlin as a position of Soviet strength, the Achilles heel of the West, the weak spot where the West can be really squeezed, rather they see it as a point of Soviet and East German communist weakness, and so that they're increasingly uneasy about this. And so rather than seeing that they're operating from a position of strength and that they can shoot down a plane as something that would be a further manifestation of their strength, they're hesitant to push things too far because they feel that they're very much in a position of weakness. Yes?
Does the dollar or the ruble play a significant role in black markets as a parallel currency?
Not so much. I mean, dollars, yes. I mean, I found some interesting examples of companies in West Berlin that were making deals with the Soviet military administration, and they described how the Soviet military administration would get rid of any red tape that was in the way, and so that they would eliminate any paperwork restrictions, and they would pay in Westmarks or sometimes even in dollars. So the dollars were present a little bit, but I think the fact that after June of 1948 you have two currencies already operating in Berlin, the Westmark and the Eastmark, and that there's a very fluid exchange just operating there. The ways in which Americans, for example, intervened in the economy there was primarily in terms of goods, cigarettes in particular, but other items that they were able to access, especially in the PX.
It seems as though the Berliners themselves saw the black market as a necessary evil at the time, and I don't know how valid that is, but my question really is, what role did the press play, particularly the U.S. press, in using the black market as a political tool in the Cold War. So, for example, if the United States wanted to criticize Soviet control of East Germany or East Berlin, would they say, well, the black market is an example of what that system has done to Berlin?
I don't think so. The way in which it operates, I think, more powerfully is essentially that they would point to West Germany after the currency reform and say that, well, all this stuff is now available in stores and that the economy is functioning normally, and that the ongoing existence of a black market in some place like the Soviet zone reflects the non-workability of the economy. Rather than, and so I think that becomes the way in which it is represented. What becomes really interesting is even up to the 1950s, there are really powerful campaigns in West Berlin against West Berliners going to shop in East Berlin or in East Germany. They see this as betraying the political principles. And so they have this big campaign against anybody who goes and buys bread, for example, in East Berlin. But it doesn't really succeed. People continue to do it because it's cheaper and it's convenient, right? It's still one city. There's no wall. You can ride the subway back and forth, and you can walk across the boundaries, and it's not a big deal. And it's a whole lot cheaper. So people wind up, their daily practices don't get swayed by that kind of ideological rhetoric. The ways in which the press engages it, certainly in the United States, has to do more with kind of moral evaluations of American troops. So there's this Harper's article in 1947 called "Millions of Guilty Men" that's talking about the moral decline of American troops that are all kind of being corrupted by being forced to occupy Europe and being stuck in this place of where they're all trying to make it rich and cash in on the good fortune that they have by being wealthy individuals in the midst of an impoverished place.
Can I ask a question about East and West? And I don't know how this applies in the 1940s specifically, but you talked about the ideological victory and the way this is taking place in the minds of Berliners. I mean, is this different for East versus West? And is there a sense in which the ideological victory seeps over into the East? Or I guess that's the question. And how does the consciousness of East and West Berliners as two separate sorts of people, does that arise yet this time, or is that part of this?
I would say that it has not arisen yet at this point, and that as much as there is this assertion of a political divide, in fact, there isn't really even a political divide for much of this period that I'm talking about. There continues to be a single Berlin municipal authority up until the end of 1948. So it's not until November of 1948 that there gets to be an East Berlin municipal authority. The police split a little bit before that, and this gradual severing of these institutional frameworks. But even after there are two separate municipal governments, an East Berlin government and a West Berlin government by the beginning of 1949, there's still an awful lot of interaction. And it's still one city, right? And there's still people who live in one half of the city and work in the other and go back and forth and go to movies or the theater or the opera in one or the other. I mean, I think you can make a case even after 1961 when the wall is built, there still is remarkable amount of moving back and forth in very different ways, and certainly more limited for East Berliners than for West Berliners. But I think that's another phenomenon that people have begun to explore as well, is which even the wall was not as an absolute of divide as people like to have asserted at the time. And the divides that people saw were kind of within their societies as well. So they would denounce people for supporting the Russians, whether they were in the East or the West. And so that there was perceived that people had a lot more flexibility in terms of casting their lot one way or the other. It's in this point where we begin to see the time in which people are making shifts and kind of voting with their feet. So that if you're a policeman, you maybe would leave East Berlin and go to West Berlin to work for the West Police or something like that. But in most instances, people's choices about which half of the city to register for rations or so on depended more about where they lived and where they worked and what was convenient and what worked for them, as opposed to any sort of ideological commitment. Yes?
You stress the importance of sort of looking at the people rather than the iconic images of the time in Berlin during that period, 46 to 49. Do you suppose that we can sort of parallel this to different points of history, and perhaps more importantly, the present situation in Iraq, where instead of having these sort of images of sectarian violence, people there are just sort of trying to survive, and it's not as divided as it seems to be?
Certainly, I'm not an expert on Iraq, but I think that there's a way in which I would agree that there is this. I think there has been, since 1989, 1990, an assertion that somehow the world is dramatically different. That somehow the Cold War world, it was dangerous, but it was stable and comprehensible. And that after the Soviet Union collapsed, after the Cold War ended, that somehow we wound up in this messy, crazy place with rogue states and dangerous nationalism and ethnic identities. So you have the war in Yugoslavia as a byproduct, in which kind of the long-standing hatreds between Serbs and Albanians and Croats that had been repressed by the communists now bubbled to the surface again. I don't believe that at all. And part of what I'm trying to argue is that all of these claims about the comprehensibility of the Cold War were misplaced, and that the Western victory in the Cold War, to a large extent, comes in spite of itself, because they never really understand what's going on, and that a lot of their policies are directed toward things that weren't actually happening, and that's one of the tensions, that the Cold War was a system, I would say, it wasn't about a battle against totalitarianism. I would say that the Cold War was itself a system that tended toward totalitarianism. That is, to suggest that the world was absolutely divided, and that there were these absolute explanations that could be deployed in Vietnam, in Cuba, in Berlin, and so on, and that was something that depended upon both Eastern and Western participation. And I think you make a similar argument today, in which kind of the global war on terror depends upon an unintentional collusion of two sides asserting absolute definitions or absolute explanations that will fit situations, whether they're in New York or in Baghdad or Kabul or Indonesia or something like that. And so that would, to my sense, that would be the parallel that would be at work. Any other questions? Well, if not, thank you very much for coming, and perhaps we can talk a little bit more afterwards.